right, we found Matt.
Okay, I can hear people.
Hey, fantastic. Well,
okay.
Other folks. So, hi. Why don't we go ahead and get started?
My apologies there. I don't know what was going on, but it didn't seem to move me into the main room for some reason. We're with everybody, but I'm sure you've all had a chance to get things started, and I just want to thank everybody for joining us for Nonprofit Branding in the Digital Age, designing online experiences that drive social change. I want to certainly thank Tristan and Sean for helping putting this together, making it possible, and absolutely to everybody for joining. So with no further delay, why don't we sort of get into it? And I'm going to tell you a little bit about myself. I've been working for the last 20 years in both branding and interactive design. I started in the interactive industry as a designer pretty much when the industry was getting going in the late 90s or mid-90s. So I've been focused on interactive for a long time, and over years have increasingly grown on brand strategy. And I founded Constructive 16 years ago. And we are a brand strategy and experience design firm. We have an exclusive focus on social change brands. We're located in New York City, and you can see some of our online information there at the bottom. So I wanted to give everyone a sense of how we'll be spending our time. We've broken this session into two parts. The first part is called Demystifying Digital Branding. We'll have a little break for Q&A, and then the second part is Process and Tools with Q&A. And wanted to sort of give a sense of what this presentation is and isn't. This presentation, much like our clients, we believe in helping expand the knowledge base and sharing knowledge with the field. And a lot of times presentations will include case studies to sort of show how something was done. And I'm not a big believer in just showing case studies. I feel like it's more important to talk about the deeper underlying principles that are driving what it is we're talking about, so that people can have a shared understanding of sort of what really contextualize things in a far deeper way, rather than jumping into here's how we solved the problem for a specific client or two, which may or may not be applicable to anyone in the audience. And that's really what the first part of this session is all about, is really doing a deep dive into that discussion to help everyone understand things that they may know some about and maybe give them a new take, and then also hopefully expose you to some new ideas. And then in the second half, we're going to go into process and tools some, and this again is going to be more talking about the elements of a good process, some of the risks to process, and then some of the tools and techniques that we use to help develop effective digital branding for social change organizations. So first, in demystifying digital branding, what are we going to be discussing? We're going to talk about what the role of a nonprofit brand is. We're going to talk about how brands create value, the theory behind creating brand value. We're going to talk about the ideas of how brands are experienced. We're going to talk about what digital branding specifically is, and then within digital branding, understanding what experience design is. And then lastly, the focus of this session is really going to be on an organization's main website. Digital branding can have a great number of things, including social, obviously, but for both sake of time and because we think it's the most important one, the website's role will be focused on. So over the years, there's been, how many times have we heard these phrases, right? I think times are changing, but this idea that the brand is somehow managed by communications and is siloed or separate from executive leadership or from program management and program leadership. Or even old certain organizations saying, well, we shouldn't look like we spend too much money on our brand. That's not necessarily good for us. Or this idea that we don't focus on our brand. We focus on our grantees. If you're a philanthropy, that's a line I've heard an awful lot. And, you know, I think there's some good reason for this, right? The traditional idea of branding really grows out of more the consumer sector. It has to do with purchasing. It has to do traditionally with advertising, ideas of selling, of persuading. And I think, unfortunately, branding, which has been an often misunderstood term, has been associated really with advertising, with ideas of marketing. And so as a result, it doesn't really focus on things that perhaps nonprofits have traditionally been interested in, because it doesn't help them advance a mission, and they're not trying to sell anybody anything. So the brand has really been utilized, not paid attention to as much as it could be, and there's a lot of skepticism about it. But the reality is that despite all this skepticism, every nonprofit still has a brand, whether you pay attention to it or not. And the only question here really is, how actively do we want to manage and cultivate it? If you think about it, a brand really ultimately is little more than the sum of things that people think and say about you. And from a nonprofit's perspective, it's really a powerful expression of your organization's mission, of your values. It speaks to and reflects your commitment, your expertise as an organization, your effectiveness, the relationships you have. All of these things are really what your brand represents. It is just a symbol or an embodiment of who you are. And the often used phrase is that a brand is not what you say you are, it's what they say you are. And I think that's a great example of the shift in idea of what a brand is. It's not advertising, it's not marketing, it's not a logo and all these other things, but it's not even what you say you are, which is really more advertising and PR and stuff like that, really. Ultimately, it's about what other people say of you. And as the number of nonprofits has increased dramatically over the last decade, the need to own a strong brand that effectively supports the broad needs of a nonprofit organization has become more important than ever. And this is especially true as the boundaries between traditional sectors are increasingly blurred. Some of you may have heard of the fourth sector and the sort of hybrid for-profit benefit corporations. And when you think about ideas of collective impact and partnerships and alliances of all types, both within and across sectors, these create new challenges and they create new options and they create opportunities for nonprofit organizations, and they also muddy what's out there that people can understand about how social change can be achieved and accomplished. There are a lot of different ways to do it now, and the models are fundamentally different than they were even a decade ago. And so this has led over time to a paradigm shift in how nonprofit brands are understood and managed. And I kind of break it down in between the new school and the old school. And as the nonprofit sector has come to the growing realization that many nonprofits cannot achieve their missions alone, the expectations of what its brand or what their brand must accomplish for them has evolved. And this has been this transition from the old school to the new school. And the shift of focus has been away from brand strategy, as it says here, as a tool that's just for fundraising and PR and marketing, we'll say, but more a strategic asset that's focused on mission implementation. So in the old school, traditionally, branding was seen as the domain of fundraising. It's the domain of the communications department. And as I stated, its origins in the consumer and for-profit sector really created long-standing skepticism of its value and, in some cases, downright disdain. And this is especially true, at least a lack of focus on its value or importance in the philanthropic sector, because philanthropies, especially family foundations, are not in the business usually of going out and promoting themselves. They haven't been traditionally. Back to we focus on our grantees and, we don't want the spotlight on us. And that's really changed, and that's where you start hearing about this new school of thinking, and it was made popular by some work with Christopher Stone from the Open Societies Foundation and Natalie Laidler-Kylander. And this idea understands that brand is the embodiment of an organization's mission and its values, that it's not just this surface-level visual design and messages, but that it's a deeper strategic driver of mission and social impact. And this
Hey, Matt.
has shifted. Yes.
Pause there for a quick second. So it's not
I'm
just
sorry?
a pretty picture? It's not just a pretty
Yeah,
picture?
so I think people have said that often enough that hopefully people realize, it's not, as I like to say, beautification and decoration, or the old ideas of design as posters and toasters. That's not what we're focused on. And I think we've seen a pretty significant shift, especially with leading organizations in this direction and understanding what it can do. And this has shifted from driving communications itself as a field from this old model of a one-way projection of an image to driving participative engagement and a whole host of other things that really have become embodied, or at least have taken off with digital design. And what it understands is that the brand must address a whole spectrum of both internal and external audiences that are ready and willing to support the organization in different ways. And as a result, brand is seen as a critical strategic asset that's focused on mission implementation organization-wide. And it's broken out of the silo, hopefully, in organizations that are thinking about it correctly, in my opinion, out of the realm of communications and design. And I think a good way to summarize this from Christopher Stone, actually, is this, and that is that a brand is a powerful expression of an organization's mission and values that can help engineer collaborations and partnerships that will better enable it to fulfill its mission and deepen its impact. And it's a strategic asset central to the success of the organization itself. And I think that idea of the organization itself is a really important one, because that really gets at the idea that it's owned by the entire organization and the responsibility of the entire organization. And so there's been emerging thought on this, most notably over the last, let's say, 5 or 6 years. And Sean and our good friends at the Communications Network have done a really great job spearheading thinking on this, along with work with Stanford's Social Innovation Review. And they've helped define through feedback and input from nonprofit leaders around the nation and maybe around the world of what's a nonprofit brand made of. And ultimately, this is where you start to understand more broadly what it is. And very simply, its relationships, reputation, and resources. And obviously, there's a lot of interplay here and things that go into it. But if we think about relationships, we can call it brand equity. You can call it issue expertise or your overall reputation. But it's the sum of this earned or perceived credibility that an organization holds around its domains or issue areas, and that can be gained in any number of ways. And it must be demonstrated, obviously, and it must be believed. And the goal, ultimately, is that organizations be mindful of the different constituencies who pay the closest attention to their actions and partners who can best help advance them. When we look at relationships, we think about success being determined by knowing our base, by being mindful of changing priorities, of attitudes, and of understanding the best ways to communicate with audiences. The deeper the relationships and the deeper the understanding of them as an organization across the entire organization, the more effective those are going to be. And when we look at reputation, we're thinking about how are these things shaped and grown over time by the choices that you make. And when you build reputation, and we'll get into a deeper dive on this on the next slide, the goal is to make consistent communication decisions and really consistent experiences and actions that are aligned with the mission. So yes, it's communications, but reputation obviously is created through experience. And those experiences, when held in aggregate, when enough people have a certain opinion of you, that's a shared reputation. And then lastly, resources are a critical component of a brand, and they come in many forms. And there obviously is human resources and expertise, and that would include, issue experts and the staff who help contribute to making organizations run, and research that is performed, and thought leadership that's generated. And you've got ideas of obviously capital like money. and grants and programs and services and even buildings, facilities. All of these things are part of what makes a brand tick. And every organization has their own unique combination of these things. And ultimately what you need to do is make tough decisions that prioritize how your brand is going to see the highest return on investment, social return on investment, based on how you manage these three parts of your brand. And so if we take a look at how nonprofit brands work, we look at this deeper meaning of what they're about. And this diagram really illustrates the critical role that a nonprofit brand plays in creating cohesion and trust, which result in capacity and impact. And it's a complex thing that was discussed again by Natalie Leidler-Kylander. And really, ultimately, you look here and you see a virtuous cycle of three circles, each which represents at the top an internal perception or attribute of the brand and a corresponding external one. And the best way to describe it is that an organizational strategy and a mission and all these things envelop these three areas. And it starts with having a strong identity. And when an organization has a strong identity, a really strong sense of itself, its people understand who they are, why they do what they do, why they show up for work every day, what the issues are, why they're together, what's brought them together. Well, you have a cohesive or a strong sense of identity. And that translates into an image. You can therefore create communications, right, that are reflective of that identity. The stronger the sense of identity, the better the image is going to be. The better you're going to portray that when you design, when you talk, when you interact with people, all of those things that help create a reputation for you or your image. And that leads to better positioning over time. Once you've done that, you all of a sudden create greater cohesion, because when you have strong positioning that's based on this very strong sense of identity, you have greater cohesion because your positioning reflects all of the things that make you tick and are part of this deeper underlying understanding of who you are. And with cohesion and consistency comes trust. It's one of the biggest elements of an effective brand. Trust, people in their relationships, you like to know what to expect. And our relationships with friends, our relationships with our spouses, our partners, whatever it may be, knowing what to expect and being able to trust that is integral to a healthy relationship. And ultimately, that's a lot of what brands are about. And so the greater trust you have, you're now able to leverage that. And now you can move into the idea of, first of all, with greater cohesion comes greater capacity. You're more effective, you're faster, you make better decisions that are clearly aligned with your identity and your sense of who you are. And that, of course, leads to greater impact. The more capacity you have, the better your choices, the greater your impact. And so you can see that this idea of what a brand is and how it works is informed by and drives all of these things. So what currency do brands trade in? And you've really got three things when you think about brand theory. You've got tangible value, intangible value, and aspirational value. And the way it goes, the theory is that the less tangible the value a brand offers, the more subjective the evaluation, the greater the potential for a disconnect. And value, the idea of a value exchange, is by its nature predicated on asymmetry, right? One side has something that the other side would like, that they value, that they would benefit from. But in many cases, there may be an underlying asymmetry in the perception of or the way what this value is communicated, the way it's communicated. And so if we look at tangible value, right, these are pretty easy to understand. It's objective. It's a thing you might get. You can perhaps hold it. And it's very, products fall into this category. And it's fairly easy to understand that value because you can see, feel, touch exactly what it is that the brand is offering. Intangible value is harder to demonstrate, though, and it's best described through sort of soft qualities, tends to be subjective. And ultimately, it's really measured in how well something fulfills an emotional or psychological need for the audience, be it their want to be altruistic, their need for security, their hope for a better planet, or their excitement for participation. And that means that it's really only measurable by the individual. Back to this idea that your brand isn't what you say it is, it's what the audience says it is. And aspirational value is a twist on this, and even higher, and I'm sure many of you understand it, right? And it's tied to the current and desired status of an individual, things we want to believe about ourselves, or things that we want others to believe about us. And aspirational value is often about satisfying this internal need. And so nonprofits very often operate on delivering intangible and inspirational value. They don't have a shiny object that they're often peddling. There's the immediate gratification often isn't there. And when the benefit is far in the future, removed from individuals' daily lives, and is the promise of a better future, well, it becomes much more difficult to communicate what the value is, and the more subjective it becomes for nonprofit organizations to communicate value when the tangible returns often are not immediately in front of us. And this gets even more complicated when you start to think about things like idea about value chains, collective impact, networks, and things that require a lot of stages, a lot of multiple partners to deliver value to somebody or to create an outcome. So the value to one person in the value chain or the network may be different than what someone else perceives it. So where is brand value created? It's at the intersection of organizational goals and audience goals. And so brands create value for their audience and themselves at the intersection of these goals. Audiences evaluate your organization's value based on how well it helps them accomplish their goals. And audience goals include both transactional ones and ones related to a person's sense of identity. So as I said, nonprofit goals, which can be often removed, require significant aspirational value, which creates unique challenges. And so how are brands experienced then? Well, design is the primary means through which your brand is experienced. And the thing about design is it's both a noun and a verb, which causes no great dismay to folks who are designers, because it describes both a process and its outcome. And so the outcome is seen as a thing. I get design. The process, however, is what makes it actually happen. And design is how your organization is ultimately understood. It communicates the promises you make. It indicates the kind of experiences people should expect. And experiences with your brand are never the same for any two people. And that's incredibly important to understand, is that when we think about experience design, everyone brings their own cognitive biases to it. Everyone brings their preferences. And so it's a unique experience regardless of how focused or consistent the brand is. And the sum of these experiences and the value that audiences find in them determines what they remember you for and what they think of your brand. And I'd like to explain when we talk about design what we're actually saying. And this is Herbert Simon, who's an American social scientist. He was a Nobel Prize winning, I'm not sure if he won it for economics, but he's an economist, a social scientist, a social psychologist. And his idea here that everyone designs who advises courses of action aimed at changing existing situations into preferred ones is really quite important, because what you realize is that there's no talk of an artifact or a thing that's designed. So everybody in their own way is a designer. When you think about even jury-rigging your sink if it's broken until the plumber can show up, you're designing a solution. And I think the really unique, strong bond between nonprofit organizations and design firms is summed up by this phrase, because we're both in the business, if you will, and we're both dedicated, and our missions are to create courses of action that change existing situations into ones that we think are better. And when we think about designed experiences, very important to understand that experiences you can't just have an experience and have it be for whatever purpose. It has to be meaningful for people to find value. Back to these ideas of where is value in a brand. And the desire for meaning is as old as humankind itself. So from tribal associations to religious symbols and heraldry, brand and identity have been an integral part of how society actually functions. And in modern society, the brands we choose to associate with are a natural evolution of our desire for meaning and identity. It's a modern condition, the idea of brands, but they exist for a reason, and we like them. And we like them because they help us with this desire for meaning. And social change brands have the power to strengthen meaning and identity by bringing people together around a shared mission, around values, or around specific goals that they may have. And digital branding and digital experiences are fundamentally different than traditional branding in the old way of doing things because they contain the sum of all online experiences, and they're no longer highly controlled. They're built on this idea, as I stated before, of participatory engagement and two-way conversations, and audiences have far greater control and choice than they ever have. And brand democracy, the theory, the concept that others control the idea of what the brand is about is at the heart of this. And online dialogue, they're primary drivers of digital branding, and websites and all of these channels allow people to quickly form and share opinions with others at very fast speeds about the quality and relevance of an organization. So when we look at organizational goals and audience goals, again, back to this idea of where value is created, well, digital branding uses design to create value by bridging the online gap between nonprofits and audiences. And all of the many things that go into an organization are ultimately kind of embodied by digital branding when people interact with you online. So when you think about it, a website really ultimately is kind of the hub of the universe for a brand and for organizations. It's tied into so many systems at this point, the complexity of them, from media relations to your CRM, to knowledge management systems, to reporting systems, to how you hold events. All of these things aren't just happening online, but they are happening in the real world as well, and they're all tied into websites. So they're the hub at the epicenter of all of these activities. So they're incredibly important, not just for digital brands and digital communications, but for the organization's functioning as a whole. And when you think about creating social change, it's really no small task, right? You've got countless things that go into what an organization does on a day-in, day-out basis, from planning strategy all the way to mobilizing audiences and sharing knowledge. And your website is an expression of all of this activity and more. Or people who don't have the opportunity to meet with you in person or who don't often will understand all of these things through their website visits. And that means that the website is an incredible proxy for what a social change organization does. We're about to hit the Q&A session, and just real quickly, the summary here. Nonprofit brands are no longer just for fundraising and PR. They've become a strategic asset. Nonprofit brands consist of these relationships, reputation, and resources. It strengthens identity, cohesion, and capacity. They are evaluated by this combination of different value. They create value and meaning at the intersection of an organization's goals and its audiences. Digital branding is fundamentally different than traditional branding and built on participation and dialogue. And a nonprofit's website is at the hub of its digital branding. So we're at halftime. The first half is a little longer than the second half. So open it up to questions, Sean.
All right, the first one comes from my friend Michelle, and she says, how do we communicate what a brand is and the importance of using brand to the field broadly? And I think by that she means our colleagues who work elsewhere in the organizations perhaps don't have the word communications in their title. They don't spend a lot of time thinking about this. They may engage with brands all the time when they run out to the grocery store or they make a Target run or whatever it may be, but they don't think about it in terms of the work that they're doing. How can you actually take some of these ideas and insights and become an evangelist within your own organization?
Well, I think, trumpeting this strong notion that the brand is the single biggest representation and embodiment of what the organization stands for with every audience from every walk of life is probably a good place to start. And that it is the shorthand, not just visually, but conceptually, for what people think about the organization and what they believe about you and what they think you're capable of and how willing they are to participate. And I think it's probably safe to say that a brand is the single most important, from my perspective, strategic asset that any organization can have, because it's the one thing that nobody else can copy. It used to be that this idea that, sort of like having a factory and the ability to produce things was a barrier to entry, and then access to capital became a barrier to entry, and then later on it became knowledge was a barrier to entry. All of these things have been made widely available to people in many different ways, but the one thing that is not available to everyone is what your brand clearly stands for and what you are uniquely able to do and why it matters. And those are the conversations that I seek to have when talking about how we can then design experiences and create experiences that reflect that.
So Maria had a question coming in from Twitter, and that is, what about mission and advocacy goals? I think I heard you say this, Matt. I just want to make sure that we dot the I here. How do we make sure that our friends in other spaces in these organizations understand that at the end of the day, we really are talking about mission. We're not somehow disaggregating it. It's integral to what we're talking about here.
Absolutely. So, when we start on a brand strategy process, if we're just working on brand strategy development, our process is all about actually clearly establishing the mission and vision for the future that's driving an organization, and then clearly understanding, working collaboratively, everyone together, to create what I call really a through line from the mission all the way down to the organizational roles that a nonprofit might play, whether it's as a convener or as a knowledge distributor, whatever those things may be. And to create a through line that starts with the mission. It's really the top of the pyramid, and everything flows from it. And so the way you focus on it is by making sure it's the North Star in everything you do, and that you contextualize all of the decisions and choices, and you contextualize the way you talk about them in service of that broader mission. And make sure that you understand operationally how these things happen. Brand strategy has a profound effect on really organizational strategy ultimately, because it aligns how an organization or sharpens focus and thinking on how to service the mission more clearly and then communicate about it.
All right, Stefan's not going to let us off the hook here. He's asking this question, and it's a great one, which is, okay, I get this, but you promised you're going to talk about the promise and possibilities and perils of brands in a digital age. And I know you talked a little bit about this earlier in the idea that we're in a more democratic era, a more fluid era in this digital age. But can you talk about that specifically? I know we're going to get to a little bit more of this later, but can you give us a little preview?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, we'll get into some of the tools bridging both traditional branding and digital. But, the first is to say, of course, that we understand that social media, for example, has had a profound impact on digital branding. It has a lot to do with how information is shared, and experiences with brands often happen not in direct contact with the organization, and that's a big change, and conversations may be happening that folks aren't really aware of. And digital brands also, the traditional idea of branding about a sense of centralized control and this sort of monolithic consistency, that really has changed dramatically when you think about responsive design, multi-screen experiences, multi-screen environments, people who move from one device to another across a relationship. And the relationship is a journey. It doesn't happen in a linear fashion. It happens really across time. And so when the sum of all online experiences, which include the idea that I might be engaging with you on a phone, I might be following you on Twitter, I might be speaking with you on Twitter, I might be looking to access knowledge and information that's made more widely available to me through your website or through a publishing platform or other ways that the internet enable organizations to communicate. And the same with holding events. Well, those things happen online in a very different way. They're much more widely available. And the thing that I'll say that's incredibly important to remember is that at this point, people expect a great user experience online. They expect the digital interface, if you will, that represents the entirety of an organization, its digital branding, to be great. It's really the barrier of entry for any organization if they're going to be online in any way. And as a result, the sort of bar has been raised, and it's incredibly important to make sure that the translation from all of these strong ideas of what a brand stands for, its value, what it means to people, and how it can help, is effectively translated into a great user experience, if you will, online. And I'll get into that a bit more in the second half.
All right, let's do one last question, and then we will move on. Matt, let's do this very briefly. Just let's play the name game.
Sure.
Who's doing this? Who is representing their brand in the digital space really well right now? And I know we're picking favorites here, but 2 or 3 names that folks could look to.
2 or 3 names. I really like what the Bar Foundation is doing right now. I'll have to tout one of our clients. I think ClimateWorks Foundation, who we did a pretty deep expression brand strategy and online design, digital design exercise, are doing a really great job. I think Amnesty has always done a phenomenal job because they're very pervasive, and it's one of the more widely sprung brands, and I think they do an exceptional job of owning what it is they stand for and how they're helping.
All right, we're going to move along now. Leah, Chiara, Susan, and others, I see you, or I see your questions. We will get to them towards the back end of this presentation, but Matt, why don't we jump back into it in the interest of time?
Absolutely, and I'd like to note anyone who would like to send us questions, or you can do so on Twitter, and you can also reach out to me directly. My information will be at the end. So, part 2, what will we be discussing? The 4 core elements of every website, the inherent challenges in designing effective in website engagements in the process. What is a process that can hopefully help us overcome these challenges? What's brand strategy's role in uniting our efforts? And a few tools and techniques that can make our process more effective. So every website's made of 4 core elements, and they're its strategic foundations. I mean, if you think about websites, they really are only these 4 things: the ideas or the strategy behind the brand, the content that's in it, the technology that drives everything, and the design that brings it all together, really. And the thing is that traditionally, there's no shortage of information. If you're a brand strategist, there's no shortage of information on how to get good at brand strategy. Same with content strategy, right? There's tons of information in books about content strategy and how it applies to digital, et cetera, et cetera. But what if you're in it's an incredibly multidisciplinary medium by its very nature. These 4 things have to work together seamlessly. I mean, they have to hum, right, in order to create great experiences. So it's incredibly multidisciplinary, yet unfortunately, most of the knowledge that's discussed about these things tends to be isolated to those areas and those practitioners. And as a result, in a lot of places anyway, what happens is that too often these online brand experiences that we're creating are designed or created by heavily siloed teams. And so while there may be some interplay across them, for sure, for example, technology may not get involved until the very end, and something gets lobbed over the wall to them fully baked, and they say, here, can you now build this? And they don't understand what the story is that's behind what's driving everything that they're about to do. And siloed teams and keeping senior leadership or program directors even out of the process, let's think about client silos, it's a surefire recipe for disaster. And because when responsibility is shared, who has the lead role in a multidisciplinary process, and whose views take precedence when we're trying to execute or implement something? And this includes the disconnect between executive leadership and operations and communications on the client side as much as it does actually on the creation side. And so in this very, very multidisciplinary, highly interdependent medium, we have an incredibly complicated process. This process lasts, a good website a large website process will last months. And there are countless conversations and decision points along the way. And the more siloed teams are, every single one of these decision points creates an opportunity for things to either be well aligned with what an overall organization's strategy and their mission is, or it creates an opportunity to have a disconnect and not actually deliver on the promise of the organization. And when users, again, expect really great informative experiences that are catered to their needs on their devices where they are, well, then you can see that there are a lot of opportunities here for these different silos to maybe misfire and to not really understand what the other one is hoping to accomplish. So what's needed here is an integrated approach that keeps everyone pulling in the same direction. And what we need really is a more effective framework ultimately for sharing, for thinking, and for addressing needs that advance a mission that increase the effectiveness of collaboration, both between client and design firm and across digital design teams within design firms. And it has to be a process that helps make sure that the total value and the effort as perceived by audiences from interacting with a brand online is greater than the sum of the parts. And it needs a process that ensures that each of the individual outcomes sought across brand, across content, across technology and design don't conflict with one another, or even worse, create problems for one another that result in experiences that are actually worse than the sum of their parts. And so in my estimation, key here is that brand strategy is that unifying force of experience design ultimately. And when it's used to drive a collaborative website process, it reduces risk and it aligns outcomes with organizational goals. And it does so because it creates, first, a co-authored understanding and a common understanding that's not in industry-specific or discipline-specific jargon about what an organization's goals are and what we're trying to accomplish. And it does so in plain speak that each practitioner, whether they're on the client side or on a design firm side, can use to guide their decision making. And when that understanding is shared by all parties, obviously the opportunity to create digital branding and online experiences that are far more tightly aligned with organizational goals is greater. And so what I've put here is an example of how we work process-wise, just to give a sense of how this might work. And it's a long process, and we can't go into an enormous amount of detail here. But the idea here, when we think about brand strategy creating a common vision across disciplines, what we're hoping to do is have a process that emphasizes direct access between the client team and the strategic leads for each of the core disciplines. And you've got director of strategy, someone like myself who's focused primarily on brand, but also has a lot of experience and works in design. You've got a design director, you've got a content strategist, and you've got a technology strategist. And it's really important from our perspective that rather than funneling everything through a project manager and controlling meetings through project managers, that direct access and collaboration and shared learning throughout the entire process leads to greater understanding of how we're going to translate strategy into execution when it comes into creating online user experiences. And when you see how the phase spreads out here, right, a typical website design and development process, you have discovery and strategy, you have UX and content strategy, then you move into design and content development, then you move into actual development, website development that is, and then you have QA testing and deployment. And what you see here is that the direct leads of the teams work directly with the client. Sometimes the folks underneath them are brought into these meetings, but they're always continuing to work. And throughout each phase, each team lead is more or less involved. These circles that you see represent a greater or lesser degree of involvement. So early on in the process, the director of strategy is really involved. During QA and development, less so. And this allows for greater collaboration, greater communication, and explanation of things. And when it's grounded by brand strategy, you then create the ability to work in a very complex medium, in a multidisciplinary, interdependent fashion in a way that will be focused on clear organizational goals and mission implementation. So now we'll go quickly through 8 tools and techniques here that can help improve our process and outcomes. There are a lot more that go into this, but I'd like to sort of share some that I think are really important and that go from the beginning of when you start doing intake into executing. And so the first are stakeholder surveys and interviews. And it's a common research process. And for us, when we think about it, individual insights, the reason we do stakeholder surveys individually in interviews is that they provide an incredible and an ideal starting point for collaborative exploration. And the reason is that, first of all, we create surveys that provide common questions and also allow for points of departure for each stakeholder. So there are common questions everyone answers, but then we kind of allow for tangents to go off based on where someone might have expertise. And by doing this, every expert can contextualize their thinking within these broader brand questions. It also creates a safe environment for stakeholders to share their opinions freely and for brand strategy leads to then use them to strengthen collaboration. So it's better to know certain things individually before you go into a big workshop and find a way to bring it out in a healthy way. And it also allows for common patterns and differences of opinion to be identified before collaboration begins, which provides the strategy leads in a process the opportunity to frame them more effectively and explore the shared interests and why those are one way and what are differences of opinion that perhaps someone in communications versus someone in program management may have. And so when we do these stakeholder surveys and interviews, we're very often then moving into brand strategy workshops. We like to sort of get engaged in understanding, and it's important to note that even in a website process, there are elements of this, even if we're not doing brand strategy. They may not be as fully baked, but they are part of our process. And so in brand strategy workshops, again, the foundation of that starts with collaborative discovery, and it really hinges on co-design. And so these workshops create a valuable opportunity to co-create a clear understanding of an organization's value that can then be translated into experience design. So it is co-authored, co-owned, and that creates the basis for designing experiences online. And it democratizes the branding process across an entire organization. It helps break through traditional operational silos to create a common vision built on trust. And this goes back to this idea that branding is not just a part of communications. It's the whole organization. And it ultimately reinforces organizational identity by clarifying mission around a common vision and shared values that can drive organizational thinking and operations. When we have all this information, a brand positioning framework is an incredibly valuable tool. And this is where you get into really communicating what an organization does and how it happens and why it matters. And again, it's this through line that I talked about, creating clear, concise language, finely crafted language that can be used flexibly across all communications, increasing messaging consistency and cohesion to different audiences, always targeted depending on who we're speaking to. And it creates a through line that connects an organization's mission at its highest level through to its operations and partnerships. And it provides a brand-driven framework for effectively evaluating digital content and for developing content strategy that's focused on creating real value for audiences. And really not even just content strategy, design strategy, technology strategy as well. For us, it's incredibly important that if there is a brand messaging framework developed, that everybody on the team read it and understand it, because they can then apply their expertise and their thinking and their creativity to solving problems within their own area of expertise and collaborate more effectively with the folks they're inevitably going to have to across brand, content, design, and technology. Another really great tool, different than the creative brief, is a digital strategy brief. And for us, the idea here is that, first of all, establishing clear goals and common ground is essential to keeping multidisciplinary teams on the same page. And what this does is provides first this we want greater context than just a creative brief. We're talking about contextualizing specific goals within a big picture driven by the brand, its ideas. And it establishes a common vision that's driven by this brand value and that connects challenges in a project, the opportunities in a project, what an audience's needs are out of the project we're trying to create, and the peer and competitive market and other things. And what's really important is that we detail clear goals for each one from a different perspective. So from a content perspective, what are we looking to do? From a design perspective, what do we need to accomplish? When we clearly identify each of those four things, it lets everyone understand and be clear on what we're trying to do across these four things. User experience research. User experience research is indispensable if it can be put into a budget because it allows us to work with real users before we start executing things and evaluate our assumptions. And you get insights that you just can't get without talking to other people. And you see barriers that you just might not understand. And what it really does that's helpful, two things. It reduces subjective decision-making, whether that's the clients or the design team, because it highlights what audiences value most or what they find most frustrating. And it helps prioritize time, budget, and effort by working on the things that matter the most. A design language system. Now, language here, we actually mean visual design language, not words. And a visual design language, digital branding demands far more than traditional brand standards deliver. When you think of the old school type of brand standards and brand guidelines, they're still important and they're a big part of communications, but they fail to account for much of what the digital landscape demands. And so when we work on creating these things, we're talking about creating things like pattern libraries and element libraries, and they take a system-based approach that, independent of devices or responsive, to flexibly solve common design problems across a variety of online touch points. And they address interaction, animation ideas, and other things in digital interfaces to ensure that there's a cohesive experience across them all. And most important, it fosters greater collaboration internally because it provides usable digital assets that people can use, remix, and work with for ongoing development across different digital platforms. And traditional brand guidelines really don't do that. And lastly, content audit and a content strategy. Content-heavy sites are all about content, and you need a roadmap, not just for what is good content, but how are we going to create it. And so you need a content audit, essential, through a brand strategy lens is most effective, to identify your content goals and gaps and how they support the brand strategy. And this is both quantitative and qualitative. How much content do we have? Where are our gaps? Or how good is the quality? How close to the brand's voice is it? Does it have too much jargon? When you combine it with UX design, it helps ensure that all the content you deliver ultimately is accessible and useful. Those two things, UX design and content strategy, cannot be separated from one another, and we do them very much together because that's how you help audiences achieve their goals, through your content. And most importantly, the last point is that it establishes publishing workflows. If you're an organization, you know how difficult it is to continue to create content, especially if you're a philanthropy or a think tank that advances thought leadership and is seeking to close knowledge gaps in the field. Well, you need to be able to produce it, and you need not just to know what your staff will have to do and make sure it's realistic, but it's really helpful in helping developers building the CMS on the back end understand how to create a more user-friendly CMS that's going to support the kind of publishing you want to do on an ongoing basis. Well, we have one more. I'm going to go quickly through two-tier user experience wireframes. A lot of you may be familiar with wireframes. And the idea here is that when we do wireframes, which are really the blueprint of a website, it's like the plumbing and where all the rooms are and the electricity. Well, we do two things. The first is start very top level and not get into the granular details of sort of laying things out as detailed wireframes can be. And the reason is that we want to quickly focus on broad buckets of content interaction so that the primary drivers of an organization's brand strategy and operations can be evaluated. We don't want to get into being more subjective about, well, this page layout, or I don't like the way this size of this type is. But then when you get more detailed, after the big decisions have been agreed upon, you can then get into more detailed design and layout-driven decisions. And that ultimately is essential for execution because it provides both your design team and your technology team with a roadmap for execution by both indicating specific design priorities. High detail wireframes should support things like explaining type hierarchies and good layout principles. They don't have to be exact, but they should be pretty close in our opinion. And they provide clear functional annotations for development. So they explain how things are going to work to speed development and make sure the way the designers would like the experience to act and be experienced by audiences is what developers will actually build. So thank you, everybody. I appreciate you joining, and look forward to your questions now. We can discuss. I'm willing to stay as long as needed, and I will put up here in the meantime as we do discuss my information for anyone who would like to get in touch. And so, Sean, I'll hand it back to you, and happy to answer everyone's questions.
We have a number of questions. The first one comes from Leah. And it sounds like she may be in the middle of this right now, and that is, what do you think is the best way to communicate a rebranding? And she's specifically asking, how do we do this digitally? How do we go out into the wider world and broadcast, I think, the fact that we're in the process of rebranding, or as she says, an identity process without scaring people?
I assume by people she means external audiences, not internal stakeholders?
You know, I have a feeling it's folks inside the organization, and it's probably a lot of the folks that are fans or actively engaged with the organization that she works for. And
well, I mean, member-driven organizations. We've dealt with this quite a bit, and I appreciate that there can be some sensitivity to this. And there's no single answer for this that is appropriate, in my opinion. I mean, I don't think you can – every situation is different, but I think it's important that – you know, look, if you think there's going to be real sensitivity, trying to evolve what the brand will, if we're talking about visuals, you just sort of, rather than completely change it up and make a complete shock, try to retain whatever value you can. I think a really important thing is to make clear that the message that is sent indicates to people what it is this brand transition is about, or that it's a natural evolution. If it's just surface level visual then, and the deeper underlying meaning is there, then it's probably not as holistic a rebranding as I would think. So I think it's just important to communicate how these things are clearly aligned and why decisions have been made based on the mission, organizational goals, and how you seek to serve your audience, your members, the community at large, et cetera.
Okay. Jen has a question, sort of a tactical one. Do you have any tool suggestions, things that you can do to help communicate across silos, to make sure the content strategy is talking to the design folks and tech folks are talking to the design folks? And inside an organization, how can you make that work really effectively? Is the answer Slack? Is it something else? That was going to be my first suggestion. I mean, Slack's a really good one, but I actually think the things we do are more organizational internally. So anyone who's understands agile working methods, you know, which I don't believe in full agile methodology, and I actually don't think it works for brand-driven projects. It's more for product projects. But the idea of the weekly stand-up, which, you know, usually development teams will do a stand-up. Well, we try to have those with everybody on the team. And the other thing is just to have frequent check-ins with one another. I mean, we work in the kind of space where it's a big open space, and there are tons of conversations always going across the tables. And one of the things that's helped with us is that we really encourage designers to think alongside developers. And the way our content management system on the back end is actually developed, our core platforms, our distributions that we use, it's heavily influenced by design thinking and by brand ideas and content goals. And so, you know, I think having weekly stand-ups with the entire team
is important. I think always referring back to the digital strategy brief is incredibly important. Using Slack is great. And creating shared project management workspaces, even like Basecamp, where just resources are used, et cetera, I think is a great way to go. But, you just can't beat old-fashioned good communication and a willingness to learn and to change the way you may think of doing something based on its impact on what other people working with you will experience.
Chiara has a question. She asks, do you see part of a foundation's brand strategy being elevating and bringing voice to other brands, such as their grantees?
Absolutely. Yeah. I couldn't say strongly enough. Yes. A big part, a brand strategy for an organization could very well be, and very often is when we're working with philanthropies, to share stories and elevate, really shine a spotlight on the hard work done by, who many philanthropists or philanthropies believe are the real heroes doing that work. And that's good practice for a philanthropy's brand. I mean, it's back to this idea that, we don't focus on ourselves, we focus on our grantees. Well, by focusing on your grantees, you actually are focusing on yourself, because you make it clear, I like to use the humble hero effect or idea, that you help make these things possible by empowering and enabling and supporting grantees. And better grantees are likely to seek you out, or you're going to be more aware of who's a better fit for you as a result. So I think there are lots of ways to do that, and digitally in particular, I think lots of foundations could do a better job of bringing their grantee profiles front and center more than just a grant management database with a perfunctory listing, and actually share real content and share some stories.
Sharon, a couple more questions, and then we will wrap this up. Everybody's been very generous with their time. I want to let everyone know who's on the call, we will be sending everyone the deck that Matt presented just after this email ends, and we will be posting this online in a couple of weeks. We're going to ask everyone, before you jump off, as you're signing off, up on your screen will pop a survey. We aren't going to email it to you. It'll pop up on your screen. Please take it. We really need the feedback. We appreciate it. Amy's question is, do you find the web traffic, that's, I guess, website traffic, is down in general as so many people are getting their information through social media? Let me take a swing at this first. Amy, I can just tell you, as somebody who runs a website for the network, we have a tremendous amount of and growing following on a number of different social media channels, but they all lead back to the website. And that may be unique to us, but we find that our website traffic is actually up over time, not down. We think that's largely because we're using social to do a lot more outreach, and so we're finding new and larger audiences. And at the end of the day, when they want deeper content and to build a relationship with us, that website, that's our storefront, that's our home, that's where we live. Matt, anything
and if I can... Yeah, Sean, certainly I think, as you're stating, the quality and intensity of social media efforts, which really does require a sustained, consistent push, is going to create that net benefit you're talking about. What I do find for sure is that engagement metrics, I believe, actually suffer a bit because of social media consumption, and that is because lots of people we build websites with a goal to, if we want to help increase knowledge and share knowledge with audiences and educate them and elevate issues and all the things that help create deeper engagement with what a social change organization is about. We try to drive deep engagement through looking at their metrics, decreasing bounce rates, increasing page views, increasing length of visit, all of those things. And when people are visiting your page actually through a Facebook browser, they are probably less likely to continue to browse because they're not experiencing the website the way it's intended. And I think that can have an effect, but I do think individual traffic can be boosted for sure that way.
I think that's all we have time for now. Thanks, everybody, for joining us. Matt, thank you very, very much for being so generous with your time and doing such an amazing amount of work to prepare for this. It's really reflected in what we saw here. Again, before you jump off, everybody, just take a minute and take the survey. It'll pop up on your screen. Shouldn't take more than a minute, maybe even less than that if you type fast. And it really helps to hear your feedback so that the network can improve its offerings. We're going to be posting the entirety of this webinar, minus the gremlins at the beginning, up online the next week or two. And a couple quick notes before I let everybody run. If you're coming to Detroit,